Hey there, before we begin, take a deep breath, settle in, and if you enjoy falling asleep to stories from the hidden corners of history, gently tap like and subscribe. It really helps. I'd also love to know where you're listening from, and what time it is right now for you. Now, put your phone face down, lower the volume, and let's drift back in time. Tonight, we wander into the rough, uncertain, and far less romantic side of the Middle Ages. You might imagine banners fluttering, feasts in candlelight, and gallant knights. But for most people, the Middle Ages were about survival, getting through the night, one uncertain day at a time. The truth is, you probably wouldn't last a day there. Our story begins, as many vast and terrible stories do, in silence. On the endless grasslands of Central Asia, the Great Steppe, where the horizon stretches forever beneath an indifferent sky. Imagine a quiet so deep it feels heavy. For centuries, that emptiness concealed a secret alliance, a bacterium, a flea, and a small rodent. The bacterium, Yersinia pestis, was not a monster. It was a fact of life. It lived peacefully, in a brutal balance, inside the blood of burrowing rodents, marmots, gerbils, great-toothed sussex. Beneath the steppe, they built enormous underground cities, their populations rising and falling with the seasons. And within those burrows, the plague was always there, a faint, steady hum of death. Here's how the cycle worked. A flea, hungry for blood, bit an infected rodent and drank from a bloodstream filled with bacteria. Inside the flea's gut, those bacteria multiplied so fast that they clogged its throat. Starving, the flea bit again and again, unable to swallow, regurgitating plague bacteria straight into the next host's blood. The rodent would sicken, swell with fever and infection, then crawl into its burrow to die. The fleas, now desperate, would leap to another living creature, and so the cycle continued, hidden under the soil, far from human eyes. For a long time, this deadly rhythm stayed quiet. But the world is never still. In the early 1300s, two vast forces began to disturb the balance. The first was climate. The mild warmth of the medieval warm period was ending, giving way to the unpredictable chill of the Little Ice Age. Droughts turned the grasslands to dust, forcing rodents to crowd around scarce water. Then floods came, driving them from their burrows. Each shift shattered the natural order, and starving fleas, desperate for any host, began biting camels, goats, horses, and sometimes, humans. The wall between animal and human disease was crumbling. The second force was human. The Mongol Empire, built by Genghis Khan and his descendants, now stretched from the Pacific to Eastern Europe, the largest land empire in history. Their rule brought an era known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, a web of secure trade routes linking east and west. Along those routes, merchants carried silk, spices, and grain, but also stowaways. The black rat, ratus, thrived in caravans and ships. And where there were rats, there were fleas. The plague, once buried in the steppe, was now traveling at the speed of trade. By the 1330s, it had reached China. By the 1340s, it moved through Samarkand and Tabriz. And by 1346, it arrived at the Crimean port of Kaffa, today's Feodosia. Then under the control of the Genoese, Kaffa was a glittering hub of Mediterranean commerce. But its prosperity drew the attention of Yani Beg, Khan of the Golden Horde, who besieged the city. As the siege dragged on, another enemy appeared, unseen, merciless, unstoppable. The plague swept through the Mongol camp. Soldiers who woke healthy were dead by nightfall. In despair, Yani Beg's forces catapulted their plague-stricken corpses over Kaffa's walls. Whether that act truly spread the infection inside hardly mattered. The bacteria's true weapons were already at work, rats and fleas. The Genoese fled in panic, boarding their ships and sailing west toward Sicily. They thought they were escaping death. Instead, they carried it with them. Weeks later, in October 1347, 12 Genoese galleys drifted into the Sicilian port of Messina. From the shore, they seemed ghostly and silent. When officials boarded, they found decks piled with corpses, and sailors barely alive, feverish, covered in black swellings. The stench of rot and salt filled the air. The ships were ordered out to sea, but it was already too late. The rats had escaped, running down the mooring ropes into the city, carrying with them the fleas that bore Yersinia pestis. Within days, the sickness began, first at the docks, then through the streets. People collapsed with fever, dark swellings in their armpits and necks. Entire families perished in days. Those who fled carried the disease further, spreading it across Sicily, Italy, and beyond. By the following year, the Black Death had arrived in Europe. It would go on to kill tens of millions, perhaps half the population of the continent. A catastrophe born not of divine wrath, but of biology. Because the killer was not a curse, nor a punishment, but a living thing, a microscopic rod-shaped bacterium, driven only to survive and replicate. It needed helpers, fleas, rats, trade routes, and people. And the world of the 14th century provided everything it required. And so, from the silence of the steppe, the greatest plague in human history began its long, slow march across the earth, carried by wind, by ships, by human hands, one unseen breath at a time. Inside the gut of the flea, something extraordinary begins to happen. Within that narrow, dark space, the bacteria awaken and begin to multiply at a staggering rate, turning the tiny insect into a living incubator of infection. They form a dense, gelatinous biofilm, a sticky, suffocating mass that clogs the flea's proventriculus, the narrow valve that connects its throat to its stomach. Once blocked, the flea is doomed. It is consumed by hunger, endlessly biting, desperately searching for nourishment that will never come. Its body is alive with need, but the passage for food is sealed. Starvation is inevitable. And yet, in those final, frantic days before death, the flea becomes the most dangerous creature on earth. Driven by the agony of hunger, it throws itself from one host to another, biting with manic desperation. Each bite is an attempt to feed, but the blockage in its gut prevents the blood from passing through. Instead, the drawn blood mixes with the growing bacterial sludge inside. Then, in a violent spasm of frustration, the flea regurgitates this infected mixture straight back into the wound it has just created. That single droplet, invisible to the eye, carries a microscopic army of Yersinia pestis. In this way, one dying flea, caught between starvation and madness, can spread death to dozens of new hosts. Every bite becomes a needle, every drop a dose of pestilence. The flea, however, is not the only accomplice in this grim chain of contagion. It rides upon another creature, its vessel, its home, its highway across continents, the black rat, Ratus ratus. This is not the brown sewer rat we know today, but a smaller, quicker, more agile animal. The black rat is a skilled climber, drawn to warmth and high places. It does not live in the filth of the sewers, but rather in the very bones of human civilization, the rafters, the attics, the thatched roofs of medieval homes. In the 14th century, it was everywhere, in the straw above peasant huts, in the beams of merchants' houses, in the dark corners of granaries, and most fatefully, in the holds of ships that carried goods, and death, across the world. The black rat lived alongside people, sharing their food, their warmth, and their waste. It was an unseen twin civilization, thriving in the shadows of the human one. When a rat died of plague, its body would quickly cool, and the starving fleas on its fur, suddenly homeless, would scatter in search of new warmth. They would crawl toward the nearest living body, a cat, a dog, or, all too often, the sleeping human family just beyond the wall. In that moment, the disease crossed the final bridge, from flea to men, and what had once been a hidden plague of vermin became an apocalypse among people. Once inside the human body, the plague revealed its most common and horrifying form, the bubonic plague. After the flea's bite, the bacteria did not immediately enter the bloodstream. Instead, they traveled through the lymphatic system, that silent internal river of the body's defense. Their destination was the nearest lymph node, the small, bean-shaped fortress where immune cells wait for battle. But against this invader, the fortress became a trap. The bacteria multiplied until the node swelled grotesquely, forming a painful, burning lump known as a bubo. The buboes rose in the groin, the armpits, or along the neck, growing to the size of an egg, sometimes even an orange. They were hot, filled with blood, pus, and bacteria, and excruciating to the touch. The body convulsed with fever, chills, and violent vomiting. Beneath the skin, dark blotches began to appear, small hemorrhages known as petechiae, blooming like bruised flowers. These black stains, these tokens of divine anger, gave the Black Death its name. For most, death came swiftly, within a few days or a week. The bubonic form killed 6 out of every 10 it touched. Yet, against all odds, a few survived. Their buboes would burst and drain, their fevers would ebb, and after weeks of agony, they would rise again, pale and changed. Those few were the living proof that survival was possible, but they were surrounded by the silence of those who were not so lucky. The second and far deadlier form of plague was the septicemic, or plague of the blood. It was a corruption from within, a silent invasion that turned the lifeblood of the body into a weapon against itself. Sometimes it emerged as a dark evolution of the bubonic strain, when the bacteria finally burst free from the swollen lymph nodes and flooded into the bloodstream. At other times, the infection began there directly, a single flea bite plunging the bacteria straight into a capillary, bypassing the lymphatic system entirely. In this form, there were no warning swellings, no telltale buboes. The body's defenses were bypassed from the beginning, overwhelmed before they could even respond. The bloodstream, once the river of life, became a highway of death. The bacteria multiplied unchecked, coursing through every vein and artery, spreading to every organ. The symptoms came swiftly and without mercy, a sudden, searing fever, exhaustion so profound the victim could barely move, stabbing pains in the abdomen, and a sickly, spreading chill that no fire could warm. As the infection deepened, the blood itself began to fail. The bacteria triggered a catastrophic condition known as disseminated intravascular coagulation, a breakdown of order within the body's circulatory system. Tiny clots formed in countless capillaries, choking the tissues of oxygen, even as the body paradoxically began to bleed uncontrollably from the nose, the mouth, and beneath the skin. The flesh turned dark, mottled, and lifeless as circulation collapsed, giving the victim the ghastly, blackened look of decay long before death had come. This was the septicemic plague, and it offered no reprieve. There was no time for the body to form buboes or mount a defense. Death was nearly inevitable, often arriving within a single day, a sudden extinguishing of life as though the blood itself had turned against its master. But it was the third and final form, the pneumonic plague, that transformed the pestilence into an apocalyptic force. This was the plague of the lungs, the form that allowed the disease to break free from its insect carriers and leap from person to person like fire leaping from house to house. Sometimes it developed secondarily, when a sufferer of the bubonic or septicemic forms became infected in the lungs. But its true terror lay in what happened next. Once the bacteria reached the airways, the plague no longer needed the flea or the rat. It could fly. The victim's cough became a weapon, each exhalation a fine mist of blood and foam, filled with invisible droplets laden with Yersinia pestis. Anyone who inhaled them could contract the primary pneumonic plague directly, without a bite, without a rat, without warning. It was the most infectious, and the most lethal, of all. The symptoms began with a burning fever, pounding headache, and unbearable weakness, soon followed by stabbing pains in the chest and a racking cough that brought up thick, bloody sputum. Within hours, breathing grew labored. The lungs filled with fluid, every gasp became a drowning. The mortality rate was not 60%, nor 90%. It was nearly absolute, as close to 100% as any disease has ever reached. Death came quickly, often within 2 days. There was no escape, no immunity, no cure. The pneumonic form gave the plague wings. It could now move untethered, through breath, through speech, through prayer, turning crowded markets, taverns, and winter churches into traps of invisible death. Every cough could kill. Every shared breath could seal a fate. This was the true engine of the Black Death's unstoppable tide, the final piece in a perfect, merciless design of nature. And so, in the autumn of 1347, that tide began its slow, inexorable creep into Europe. Its point of entry was not a battlefield or a royal court, but the bustling, sunlit harbor of Messina, on the island of Sicily. There, under the creak of rigging and the cries of dockworkers, a dozen Genoese merchant galleys limped into port, weary from their long voyage across the Mediterranean. They had come from the Black Sea, from the distant trading outpost of Caffa, a fortified Genoese colony on the Crimean Peninsula. Their cargo holds were filled with silks, spices, and precious goods, and hidden among the barrels and sacks, a far darker cargo, rats, fleas, and the living plague itself. Chroniclers would later tell a dramatic tale. According to the notary Gabriel de Mussy, the Mongol army that besieged Caffa had flung plague-ridden corpses over the city's walls with catapults, an act of primitive biological warfare. Perhaps the story holds a grain of truth. But the catapults were hardly necessary. The rats, ever the stowaways of human commerce, had already done their work. They had crept aboard the ships as they always did, drawn by the warmth of the hull, the scent of grain, and the promise of shelter. The Genoese sailors, thinking they had escaped the mysterious illness that had ravaged their comrades in the east, had unknowingly brought the seeds of apocalypse home with them, hidden not in their cargo, but in the very timbers of their vessels. When the Genoese ships finally reached the harbor of Messina, the Sicilians who gathered along the docks were greeted not by the usual bustle of trade and voices of sailors, but by a sight that seemed torn from a nightmare. The galleys drifted silently, their sails slack, their decks eerily still. They were ghost ships, floating tombs. Most of the crew lay dead, their bodies swollen, discolored, and covered with the telltale dark blotches of disease. Those few still alive stumbled like drunkards, delirious with fever and pain, crying out to a God who seemed to have abandoned them. The authorities on the shore acted swiftly, or so they believed. In horror and confusion, they ordered the ships away, hoping that by driving out the dying sailors they could drive away the sickness itself. But the decision came far too late. The plague had already crossed the invisible boundary between ship and shore. The rats, drawn by the smell of food and refuse, had scurried down the mooring ropes. The fleas, tiny, unseen couriers of death, had already found new hosts among the unsuspecting people of Messina. The disease exploded across the city like wildfire in dry grass. Panic spread faster than the sickness itself. Michael of Piazza, a Franciscan friar who witnessed the catastrophe firsthand, later wrote that once the citizens realized the fatal evil had been brought by the Genoese, they drove the foreigners from the harbor, but their expulsion changed nothing. The sickness remained, he wrote, and a terrible mortality began. The plague did not move like any known illness. It struck like a curse, silent and sudden. A person could go to bed perfectly healthy and be found dead at dawn. Whole families vanished within a few days. Priests refused to enter the houses of the sick, even the living avoided one another, fearing that a single breath might be their last. From Sicily, the pestilence followed the currents of commerce, the great liquid highways of the Mediterranean. Merchant ships, desperate to escape the island, became its unwitting emissaries. By January of 1348, it had reached Genoa and Venice, the proud maritime republics that powered Europe's trade. These glittering cities, engines of wealth and culture, became instead the central distribution hubs of death. From Venice, the plague crept inland, seeping through the fertile plains of the Po Valley. From Genoa, it sailed westward to Marseilles, the great French port. Everywhere it landed, the same dreadful pattern repeated itself. A ship would arrive, a few sailors, pale and weak, would stagger ashore, and within weeks, the entire port would be consumed. From Marseilles, the infection surged northward, following the Rhône River like a shadow. It reached Avignon by spring, a city that, at that time, was not merely another urban center, but the very heart of Christendom. The papal court resided there, under Pope Clement VI, a man versed in politics and theology but utterly unprepared for the horror that now unfolded around him. As the plague ravaged his city, half of his household perished. The cemeteries overflowed. In despair, Clement consecrated the entire Rhône River, declaring its waters holy so that corpses could be cast into it, granting at least the illusion of a Christian burial. He himself survived only by isolating in his chambers, seated between two great roaring fires. The heat, meant to purify the air, turned out to be a crude but effective barrier against the plague-bearing fleas. The year 1348 was when the inferno truly took hold. As Avignon burned with fever, the pestilence swept deeper into France, reaching Paris by summer, less than 6 months after leaving the Mediterranean coast. Paris, one of Europe's largest and most crowded cities, became a graveyard. Chroniclers estimated that as many as 800 people died every single day at the height of the outbreak. Simultaneously, the plague advanced across the sea from Italy's western ports to Pisa, then leapt to the islands of Corsica and Sardinia. It entered Spain through the bustling harbors of Barcelona and Valencia, racing like a brushfire through the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. In France, it reached Bordeaux, the jewel of the English-held territories in Gascony. By the late spring of 1348, the pestilence had found its next great journey, across the English Channel. Bordeaux's main export was wine, and the ships that carried the casks north carried death as well. Around the 24th of June, one such vessel docked at Melcombe Regis, in what is now Dorset. A sailor, perhaps feeling only slightly unwell, stepped ashore, and with him, the Black Death arrived in England. At first, it spread slowly, creeping through the quiet market towns of the southwest. But by August, it had reached Bristol, a major port whose trade links extended across the kingdom and beyond to Ireland. Once established there, the plague accelerated, moving with terrifying speed along the coastal routes and inland rivers. It followed the Thames Valley east, directly toward London. The capital trembled before it even arrived. Rumors had been spreading for months, of whole cities extinguished, of families found dead in their beds. Even King Edward III had not been spared the plague's cruelty. His own daughter, Joan, had died in Bordeaux while journeying to Spain to be married. In the autumn of 1348, the first cases appeared in London's western parishes, filthy, crowded neighborhoods where the air itself seemed thick with decay. As winter came, the disease appeared to slow. People dared to hope that perhaps it had run its course. But the cold and damp of 1348–49 were perfect conditions for the pneumonic form, the plague of the lungs. By spring, London was drowning in death. The plague filled the city like a rising tide. Mass graves were dug beyond the walls, plague pits, vast trenches into which the dead were laid in rows. From the capital, the infection spread outward like ripples in water, to the farmlands of East Anglia, through the Midlands, and north to the great city of York. It crossed into Wales, and by ship from Bristol, it reached Ireland, devastating the Anglo-Norman towns while sparing, for a time, the rural Irish beyond. By the close of 1349, all of England was in its grip. And yet, even then, the plague was not done. That same year, it crossed the North Sea. One account, perhaps more legend than fact but chillingly plausible, tells of a wool ship from London found drifting near the coast of Bergen, Norway. When locals boarded, they found only corpses, and a deadly cargo. The Norwegians brought the pestilence ashore. From there, it spread through Scandinavia, to Sweden, Denmark, and beyond. By 1350, the wave was breaking across the continent. The plague had reached the cities of the Hanseatic League, crept eastward into Poland and Bohemia, and by 1352, it struck Novgorod and Moscow. In less than 5 years, a single microscopic organism, carried by a flea upon a rat, had traveled the arteries of human trade and communication from the shores of the Black Sea to the frozen fjords of Norway, leaving behind a trail of devastation unlike anything the world had ever seen. Medieval physicians faced the Black Death armed not with science, but with theory, a fragile lattice of humors, astrology, and superstition. Believing the plague to be a hot and wet disease, born from an excess of blood, they sought balance the only way they knew how, by letting that blood out. A patient would be seated, trembling with fever, and the physician, robed in dark cloth, face hidden behind a beaked mask stuffed with herbs, would open a vein, often on the side opposite the swollen bubo. The blood would flow freely into a bowl until the sufferer, already weakened by infection, grew pale and faint. In their desperate attempt to heal, the doctors drained away what little strength remained, hastening the death they were trying to prevent. When veins could no longer be found, they turned to nature's small physicians, leeches. These slick, hungry creatures were applied to the skin to suck out the corrupted blood. The sight must have been both grotesque and strangely hopeful, rows of limp, feverish bodies, their skin stippled with small, writhing leeches under candlelight. The buboes, great dark swellings that gave the bubonic plague its name, became the focus of medical obsession. To physicians, they were the body's attempt to purge the poison within. Their duty, then, was to help the process along. And so, with trembling hands and a clean blade, a small mercy, they would lance the swelling, slicing open the tender flesh. The wound erupted in a rush of pus and blackened blood, releasing a stench so foul it filled the room for hours. After the incision came the poultices, medieval science at its most surreal. These were no gentle herbal balms, but bizarre concoctions of resin, crushed lilies, onions, or even human waste mixed with figs and oil. Some treatments defied belief. One common method involved taking a live pigeon, cutting it open, and pressing its bleeding body against the patient's bubo. It was said the bird would absorb the poison into its own flesh, sparing the human. The reality was only more death, more infection. For the wealthy, cures became luxuries of status. Emeralds were ground into powder and mixed with wine. Gold leaf was swallowed like medicine. The famed compound theriac, a thick honey jam from ancient Rome, was prescribed in great quantities. It contained dozens, sometimes hundreds of ingredients: cinnamon, myrrh, opium, and even the flesh of vipers. It was called a universal antidote. In truth, it did nothing at all. The most respected physician of the age, Guy de Chauliac, personal doctor to Pope Clement VI, left one of the most haunting testimonies of that time. From his chambers in Avignon, one of the plague's epicenters, he observed the sickness with a cold, scientific clarity. He noted the difference between its two forms, the bubonic, which brought fevers and swellings, and the pneumonic, which invaded the lungs and spread by breath, killing within days. But even with such insight, he could offer no hope. The plague, he wrote, was so contagious that one man might infect the whole world. He confessed that physicians dared not visit the sick, and when they did, they could do nothing. De Chauliac himself fell ill, a great swelling appeared in his groin, and fever raged for 6 weeks. He lanced his own bubo with a knife, and miraculously survived. He attributed this not to medicine, but to divine mercy. "I lived," he said, "by the grace of God, not by the art of men." It was an admission of total defeat. The healers had failed. Their books, their potions, their theories of humors and vapors, elegant nonsense, powerless before the microscopic truth of Yersinia pestis. As the physicians withdrew, their robes stained with the blood of the dying, the people turned their gaze upward. If the wisest men could not explain this terror, then surely it was no earthly disease. This was judgment, divine, absolute, and merciless. The plague was understood as flagellum Dei, the scourge of God, a biblical punishment visited upon mankind for its pride and sin. The sermons of the priests grew thunderous and grim. From the pulpits, they railed against vanity, against the sin of fashion, against the greed of merchants and the endless wars between Christian kings. Each sin, they declared, was another spark that had lit the fire of God's wrath. But their words, like their prayers, went unanswered. The churches, once sanctuaries of comfort, became chambers of death. Priests anointed the sick with holy oil, and died beside them. In many regions, up to 70% of the clergy perished. The dead priests were replaced by the young and untrained, ordained in haste to fill the ranks. The authority of the Church, the foundation of medieval life, began to crumble from within. Into this vacuum of faith and leadership stepped a new and terrifying movement, the Flagellants. It began in Germany in 1348, a spontaneous eruption of collective guilt and fear. Groups of men marched from town to town, barefoot, stripped to the waist, carrying heavy scourges made of leather thongs tipped with iron spikes. They gathered in town squares, formed circles, and began their ritual. As their leader chanted prayers, they struck themselves again and again. The sound, the rhythmic slap of leather, the ring of metal, the cries of agony, echoed through the streets. Blood streaked their backs, turning their bodies into living symbols of penance. To the people, they were saints in motion, men who bled for all of humanity, whose suffering might turn away the wrath of God. Towns welcomed them, fed them, sheltered them. But soon, their processions grew larger, more frenzied. The Flagellants began to preach their own gospel, that their ritual, performed for 33.5 days, could cleanse the world of sin without priests or sacraments. They claimed to have letters from heaven itself. This was heresy and danger. Their movements from town to town, often between infected regions, spread the plague faster. By 1349, Pope Clement VI recognized the threat. He denounced them as heretics and ordered them suppressed. But by then, the damage was done. Their brief reign of terror burned itself out, leaving behind a landscape even more fractured, more faithless, more afraid. The plague had not destroyed faith in God, it had destroyed faith in man. If the Church could not protect its flock, what authority did it truly have? If the pious died alongside the wicked, what justice could there be in heaven? This spiritual wound would never fully heal. Over the next centuries, it would fester, until it burst in the fires of the Reformation. And as the faith in divine order crumbled, the terrified mind turned elsewhere for answers. If this was not God's wrath, it must be someone's crime. Rumors began to spread, whispers at first, born in the taverns and market squares of southern France, that the Jews had poisoned the wells. That they were servants of the devil, agents of a grand conspiracy to destroy Christendom. The story spread faster than the plague itself. It was a perfect lie, simple, vivid, and cruel. In an age when logic meant little, people chose the comfort of a human enemy over the terror of an invisible one. And so began one of the darkest waves of persecution in medieval history. In September 1348, at Chillon Castle on the shores of Lake Geneva, a group of Jews were arrested and tortured. Under the agony of the rack, a man named Balavignus confessed to everything, to poisoning wells, to conspiracies, to crimes that never happened. His words, extracted under torment, were copied and spread like scripture, carrying death with them from one city to the next. In Basel, Switzerland, hundreds of Jews were locked inside a wooden barn on an island in the Rhine. The structure was set ablaze. None survived. In Freiburg, Augsburg, Mainz, and Cologne, the pattern repeated: accusation, mob, massacre. The most horrifying came in Strasbourg, in February 1349. The plague had not yet arrived, but the fear had. The city's guilds, deeply indebted to Jewish moneylenders, demanded action. The city council resisted, but the mob overthrew them. On St. Valentine's Day, nearly 2,000 Jews, men, women, and children, were marched to their cemetery. A great wooden platform had been built there. Those who converted to Christianity were spared, their children taken from them to be baptized. The rest were bound, placed on the platform, and burned alive. Their homes were looted. Their debts erased. Their ashes scattered to the wind. And weeks later, the Black Death finally came to Strasbourg, indifferent to the blood already spilled. But this only served to inflame the attackers further. A massive, furious mob descended upon the Jewish quarter, and in one of the largest massacres of the plague years, the entire community, some 6,000 men, women, and children, was annihilated. In countless towns and cities, facing the certainty of violent death at the hands of enraged neighbors, entire communities chose a final, tragic act of defiance. In desperate solidarity and faith, they set fire to their own homes and synagogues, choosing to die by their own hands rather than face forced conversion, violence, or the erasure of their religious identity. Voices of reason and compassion existed, but they were few and weak, easily drowned out by the roaring tide of fear and fanaticism. Pope Clement VI, based in Avignon, issued 2 papal bulls in 1348, declaring the Jews innocent of the baseless accusations of well poisoning. He stated what should have been obvious: the plague was an act of God, striking Jews as indiscriminately as Christians, and threatened excommunication for anyone who harmed them. Some rulers, like Duke Ulrich II of Austria and King Casimir of Poland, offered protection and sanctuary, prompting Jewish refugees to move eastward, where new centers of Jewish life flourished in Poland and Lithuania for centuries. Yet in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, in the free cities of Germany and Switzerland, the Pope's decrees were ignored. Local authorities, widespread popular hatred, and naked greed proved far stronger than distant papal edicts. The persecution became a grim and horrifying chapter in the long history of European anti-Semitism, but the Black Death intensified it to an unprecedented degree. The plague demonstrated the terrifying power of conspiracy theories to explain the inexplicable. For a terrified populace, it was easier to believe in a vast human plot than in a microscopic organism or the inscrutable will of God. By blaming the Jews, communities felt a sense of agency amid total helplessness. Passive victims of a disease became active participants in what they imagined as a holy struggle. In killing their perceived enemy, They believed they could cleanse their community, purify it, and perhaps even appease a god who seemed absent. Yet the wells remained untainted, not by human hand but by a world fundamentally changed and scarred by fear. The fires that consumed Jewish communities left a permanent stain on the moral and psychological fabric of Europe, a chilling testament that the deadliest plague is not always the one that attacks the body, but the one that feeds on terror and infects the human heart. The very fabric of European life seemed to unravel, not in a violent rupture but in a slow, silent unthreading of the social tapestry. In cities, where humans had once packed themselves tightly together, the change was most palpable in the oppressive silence. The bustling clamor of urban life, the clatter of wagon wheels over cobblestones, the shouts of vendors, the hammering of blacksmiths, the distant tolling of church bells marking the hours, vanished almost overnight. Now the bells rang ceaselessly, a monotonous knell of death, until there were no longer enough living to toll them for the dead. And then even that sound faded. The silence that replaced it was thick, almost tactile, laced with fear so heavy it could be tasted in the metallic, sour tang of the air. The Florentine chronicler Giovanni Baccio tried to capture the psychological vertigo of this collapse. He described a world in which the laws of God and men simply ceased to operate, not because they were overthrown, but because there were no longer enough people left to enforce them, and few still cared to try. Judges, notaries, and officials had perished or been rendered powerless by the scale of the catastrophe. In this vacuum, an eerie liberty emerged, but one pregnant with danger. Some responded with unbridled hedonism. They wandered from abandoned tavern to tavern, drinking whatever was at hand. They occupied the empty mansions of the wealthy, living in opulent squalor for days or weeks, until the telltale buboes appeared on them as well. They held debauched feasts and dances, convinced that joy, music, wine, and laughter could ward off the melancholy of death, a frantic, desperate dance on the edge of the abyss. Others chose the opposite path, locking themselves away in hermit-like isolation. They ate delicacies sparingly, drank fine wines in measured quantities, avoided contact with anyone outside their walls, and passed their time in prayer and music, constructing fragile bubbles of order amid chaos. Still others walked a middle road, carrying flowers and herbs, holding them to their noses as they traversed the empty streets, hoping the scents could counteract the invisible pestilence. All were equally vulnerable to the plague. The bonds of family and kinship dissolved almost instantly. Baccio wrote with stunned horror that brothers abandoned brothers, uncles neglected nephews, sisters ignored brothers, and wives deserted husbands. The most unnatural of all, he observed, was the abandonment of children. Parental instincts, honed over millennia of biology and culture, evaporated under the relentless terror of the disease. A sick child might cry alone in a silent house while the mother, hearing the cries from another room, would steal away to save herself. The ill were left to fend entirely for themselves, often accompanied only by the rats scuttling in the walls. Occasionally, a servant might bring food in exchange for high pay, but more often, the afflicted died alone. Commerce ground to a halt. Workshops were shuttered, their masters and apprentices dead or in hiding. The great marketplaces of Siena, Genoa, and other cities, once bustling with merchants from across the known world, stood empty, weeds growing between the stones. Ships rotted at their moorings, crews dead, valuable cargoes of silk and spice untouched. Money lost its meaning, A purse full of silver was useless when there was no bread, no physician willing to visit, no priest to give last rites. Survival became the only currency. The disposal of the dead became a matter of grim necessity. Initially, coffins and traditional funerals persisted, but the sheer numbers soon overwhelmed the system. Churchyards filled and overflowed. The solution was brutal but essential: plague pits. Massive trenches were dug outside city walls. At night, men called the bekamini, often criminals or those with nothing left to lose, would cry, "Bring out your dead," as families dragged corpses to carts. Bodies of men, women, and children, rich and poor alike, were piled into the pits, layered with dirt like lasagna, all individuality erased. Even in the papal city of Avignon, the Pope consecrated the entire Rhine River so that corpses thrown into it could still be considered buried in holy ground. The psychological toll was enormous. People saw God's wrath in the plague, believing it a punishment for wickedness. Processions of flagellants moved through the streets, whipping themselves raw in the hope of divine mercy, often spreading the disease further. Communities turned on one another in search of scapegoats, particularly the Jews, who were accused of poisoning wells. Entire communities were annihilated, as in Strasbourg in February 1349, where 2,000 Jews were burned alive. Even in large Jewish centers like Mainz, communities resisted but were ultimately overwhelmed. These pogroms were a dark testament to humanity's instinct, under terror, to destroy rather than unite. When the plague eventually moved on, survivors emerged into a devastated world. In many regions, fewer than half the population remained. Streets were lined with empty houses, fields overgrown, manors abandoned with their lords buried alongside serfs. This emptiness became a crucible for social transformation. Land was abundant, labor scarce, an inversion of the medieval equilibrium. Surviving peasants realized their newfound bargaining power. Lords had thousands of acres but no hands to cultivate them. Peasants could demand wages, freedom, or better conditions. Many simply walked away from the lands their families had tilled for generations, seeking more favorable arrangements. Competition for labor caused wages to soar, while livestock prices plummeted, allowing peasants to acquire property, livestock, and autonomy. The rigid hierarchy of serfdom began to crumble. The nobility perceived this shift as a divine affront and attempted to legislate control. In England, the 1351 Statute of Labourers sought to freeze wages and restrict mobility. It failed. Economic reality outpaced royal decree. Peasants continued to migrate, exploit new opportunities, and assert their freedom. This simmering discontent would eventually explode in the 1381 Peasants' Revolt. Tens of thousands, led by figures such as Wat Tyler, marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom and unjust laws. They captured the Tower of London and executed officials, including the Archbishop of Canterbury and the King's Treasurer. The rebellion was crushed, but the message lingered: the old feudal order was irreparably weakened. Over the next century, wage labor and cash rents gradually replaced unpaid serf labor, laying the foundations of modern capitalism. The Black Death did not act alone in shaping these changes, but it was an extraordinary catalyst. It cleared the board, allowing new social, economic, and demographic arrangements to emerge. Yet, just as Europe began to rebuild, the plague remained a persistent presence. The Great Pestilence of 1347 to 1351 was merely the opening act. Yersinia pestis established itself in rat populations, becoming endemic and flaring up periodically in deadly epidemics for centuries. The pestis secunda of the 1360s, pestis tertia in the 1370s, and many subsequent waves. Each outbreak reopened old wounds, reminding people of their vulnerability. Later epidemics, though sometimes more localized, could be just as ferocious. The Great Plague of Seville in 1649 wiped out nearly half the city. Perhaps the most infamous was the Great Plague of London in 1665. The overcrowded city, with narrow streets and timber-framed houses, provided perfect conditions for disease. The outbreak began in the poor parish of St. Giles in the Fields. Initially suppressed, official mortality bills revealed the scale of the catastrophe: 43 deaths in May, over 500 in June, 6,000 in July, 17,000 in August, and at its peak over 7,000 in a single week. London descended into a familiar nightmare. The wealthy, including King Charles II, fled, the poor remained. Houses with the sick were sealed, marked with red crosses, and guarded for 40 days, a brutal form of imprisonment and often a death sentence. Carts roamed at night, crying, "Bring out your dead," echoing centuries-old practices. Daniel Defoe, a child at the time, later immortalized this terror in his vivid journal, capturing the silence, the overgrown streets, the wailing from sealed houses, and the endless procession of carts to plague pits. Roughly 100,000 Londoners, 1/4 of the population, perished. The Great Fire of 1666, though catastrophic, may have inadvertently ended the outbreak by burning rat-infested slums and allowing reconstruction with wider streets and brick houses. Between the first Great Wave and the last flickers of the second pandemic, human response evolved. The religious panic, fatalism, and scapegoating of the 14th century slowly gave way to observation, organization, and public health measures. The concept of public health was born from recurring plague crises. One of the first rational innovations was quarantine. The maritime Republic of Ragusa, on the Dalmatian coast, pioneered the practice. In 1377, the chief physician Jacob of Padua recommended that incoming ships from plague-infested areas anchor at a nearby island for 30 days, the Trentino, before being allowed to enter. Later extended to 40 days, or quarantino, this gave birth to the modern concept of quarantine. Venice soon adopted and perfected the system, establishing the world's first permanent plague hospital, or lazaretto, on an island in the lagoon in 1423. During the height of plague outbreaks, dedicated facilities emerged to isolate and treat the sick, an innovative and radical approach for the time. By the 15th century, prominent Italian city-states such as Florence and Milan had established permanent health boards or magistracies of health. These were powerful civic institutions, endowed with broad authority in times of epidemic. They could enforce quarantines, supervise the disposal of the dead, prohibit public gatherings, and deploy a fearsome symbol of the era, the plague doctor. The image of the plague doctor, with his elongated, bird-like mask, remains one of the most chilling visual legacies of the period. The costume, likely developed in the 17th century by the French physician Charles Delorme, was an early attempt at personal protective equipment. Its long beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs, straw, and spices such as mint, cloves, and camphor, believed to purify the miasmatic air thought to carry disease. The doctor's body was shielded by a long waxed leather coat, leggings, gloves, and a broad-brimmed hat, and he carried a wooden staff to examine patients without direct contact. These practitioners were not always fully trained physicians. Often they were junior doctors or men willing to assume enormous risk for high pay. Their role was less about curing patients, rarely possible, and more about public administration, recording deaths, witnessing wills, and serving as the state's visible enforcers against the pestilence. They were simultaneously feared and respected, grim emissaries of death, representing humanity's first organized secular effort to confront a public health crisis. By the 17th and 18th centuries, these measures had evolved into a sophisticated, if ruthlessly efficient, system of containment. One such method, the cordon sanitaire, involved sealing entire towns or regions with armed guards, authorized to shoot anyone attempting to enter or leave. The last major outbreak in Western Europe, in Marseille in 1720, demonstrated the full force of these methods. The plague arrived via a single merchant ship from the Levant. Despite quarantine protocols, the disease spread into the city. The French state responded on an unprecedented scale, constructing the Mur de l'Est, a 2-meter-high stone wall patrolled by soldiers, to isolate Marseille and the surrounding Provence region from the rest of the country. Though horrifyingly effective, the cordon could not prevent the death of some 100,000 people within its bounds. The episode illustrated a radical evolution. Public health was no longer a matter of prayer or divine intervention. It was now a technical, administrative, and militarized operation, dependent on borders, guards, and enforced isolation. Over centuries of suffering, humanity had developed essential tools: quarantine, health boards, meticulous data collection, and state-enforced containment, that would lay the foundation for modern epidemiology and the ongoing struggle against infectious disease. When the plague finally abated and survivors cautiously emerged from shuttered homes into a world marked by profound emptiness, they faced not only demographic loss but a psychological and cultural shock. How does a society process such a staggering trauma? How can one reconcile the arbitrary destruction of life, the child taken while the sinner survived? Traditional religious explanations, preachers' sermons, gilded illuminations, and the comforting hierarchy of divine providence, now rang hollow. The mystery of God's plan became inscrutable, terrifying in its seeming randomness. In the absence of comforting words, people turned to visual expression to make sense of the incomprehensible. Prior to the Black Death, religious art emphasized serenity, idealized beauty, and symbolic sacrifice. Christ's suffering was noble rather than visceral. Saints gazed heavenward in beatific calm, and art offered a meditative, spiritual reassurance. But post-plague, a stark realism emerged. Blood ran redder, thorns cut deeper, and death could no longer be depicted as a distant, symbolic abstraction. Artists, many of whom had witnessed the devastation of their families and patrons, abandoned idealized visions of the world for raw representations of mortality. From this obsession with death arose the macabre genre of the danse macabre, the dance of death. Unlike celebratory dances, this was a procession of inevitability, a grim reminder that no social rank, wealth, or piety could shield anyone from death. Painted on church walls, printed in woodcuts, and most famously immortalized in murals like the Cemetery of the Holy Innocents in Paris, the dance depicted skeletons leading popes, emperors, knights, merchants, maidens, scholars, farmers, and infants into the same inexorable fate. It was a democratic, terrifying, yet strangely comforting message. Death is impartial, and in a world shaken by plague, this absolute certainty offered a measure of reassurance. The obsession with mortality extended beyond imagery. Tombs and funerary art transformed dramatically. Serene effigies of nobles, once depicted sleeping peacefully, were often replaced by trance-eye tombs, sculptures showing both the deceased in their worldly glory above and their decayed, emaciated corpse below, sometimes crawling with worms or toads. Inscriptions, such as you are, I once was. As I am, you will be, reminded survivors of the inescapable reality of death. Poetry and verse echoed similar themes, acknowledging the shared, unavoidable fate of all social classes. Death, once abstract, became central to the collective consciousness, a constant, almost musical accompaniment to daily life. The cultural and social upheaval wrought by the plague did not stop at imagery. With the old hierarchies shaken and institutions discredited, new opportunities emerged. The rigid pyramid of feudal society, peasants bound to the land, lords and knights presiding over them, and kings atop all, was destabilized. Labor became a scarce and highly valuable commodity. Survivors could demand better wages, migrate in search of work, and assert personal autonomy. Laws like England's 1351 Statute of Labourers, intended to freeze wages and restrict movement, failed spectacularly. Markets dictated new conditions. Peasants, artisans, and craftsmen all found themselves with leverage, and the bonds of serfdom slowly dissolved. Cities thrived as guilds reopened and admitted new members, while estates and inheritances were redistributed through sudden, catastrophic loss. The economy was reborn from the chaos, creating new wealth for survivors and a rising merchant and banking class that would fund art, scholarship, and architecture. Florence's Medici family, for instance, built its fortunes amid the post-plague economy, channeling wealth into the construction of the Duomo and patronage of Renaissance art. The Church, by contrast, suffered a crisis of authority. Its inability to prevent or explain the plague, combined with abuses such as the sale of indulgences, eroded credibility and fostered cynicism. While faith persisted, it often became personal and mystical, rather than institutional. Into this spiritual and cultural vacuum, humanism emerged, a philosophy celebrating human potential, individual achievement, and the beauty of the natural world, drawing inspiration from classical Greece and Rome. In the shadow of death, humanity sought life, knowledge, and pleasure. Stories, art, and scholarship flourished, reflecting a new confidence in human creativity and reason. Finally, the Black Death was not only a social and cultural turning point but also a profound biological event. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the plague, acted as a selective pressure on the population. Survival was not random. Subtle variations in immune function conferred protection on a fortunate minority. Over generations, these survivors passed advantageous traits to their descendants, reshaping the European gene pool. One of the best documented examples is the CCR5 delta 32 mutation, a deletion in a gene coding for a receptor on white blood cells that certain pathogens use to infect cells. Though likely present at low levels before the plague, it conferred a significant survival advantage during the outbreak. In this sense, the Black Death acted as a brutal, continent-wide experiment in survival, leaving its mark not only on European society, culture, and economy but also on the very biology of its people. The Black Death reshaped the continent, toppling social hierarchies, challenging religious authority, catalyzing economic change, inspiring new art and humanist thought, and leaving a lasting imprint on human genetics. From the ashes of the pestilence arose the Renaissance, a civilization built upon the lessons, grief, and resilience of those who survived the great mortality. In this way, Europe learned, painfully but irrevocably, that from death itself could spring new life, new ideas, and a profound reimagining of the human world. Individuals carrying a single copy of the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation had a significantly higher chance of surviving infection during the plague, while those with 2 copies were likely even more resistant. Over the centuries of recurring outbreaks following the initial Black Death, this mutation became increasingly common across Europe. It serves as a living genetic relic, a molecular scar left by one of history's deadliest pandemics. In an extraordinary twist of evolutionary fate, this ancient defensive trait has continued relevance. The same CCR5 protein that Yersinia pestis may have exploited is also the primary receptor that HIV uses to enter human cells. Today, a notable portion of people of European descent carry this mutation, granting them a natural resistance to HIV infection. Thus, the desperate fight of medieval ancestors against one catastrophic disease inadvertently conferred protection against another, 6 centuries later. The impact of the plague was not only genetic but profoundly institutional. The pandemic exposed the complete inadequacy of medieval medicine. Dominant theories such as the 4 humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and the belief in miasmas, or contaminated air, proved useless. Treatments ranged from bloodletting and purging to bizarre applications of pigeon dung mixed with tree resin, often hastening death rather than preventing it. The catastrophic failure of these approaches forced a slow and painful reassessment of medical knowledge. While old ideas did not vanish overnight, the seeds of empirical observation and anatomy-based medicine were planted. Physicians, often defying religious prohibitions, began performing autopsies to observe directly the effects of disease on the human body. These grim explorations marked the first tentative steps toward a systematic, evidence-based medical practice. Equally transformative was the emergence of public health as a formal concept. Before 1347, the health of an individual was a private or family concern, perhaps mediated by a priest. The notion that the state could take responsibility for the collective health of its citizens was entirely unprecedented. The enormity of the Black Death forced civic authorities to intervene. In Italy, the maritime republics, exposed to both trade and disease, led the way. The city-state of Ragusa, on the Dalmatian coast, was among the first to mandate that ships arriving from plague-affected regions must remain in isolation outside city walls for 30 days. This period was later extended to 40 days, quarantina, giving rise to the term quarantine that we still use today. Venice, the dominant naval power, perfected the system, establishing the first formal quarantine station, or lazaretto, on an island in its lagoon in 1423. Ships were anchored offshore, cargo fumigated with vinegar and aromatic herbs, and crews isolated under the supervision of the newly created Board of Health. These magistrates wielded extraordinary powers. They could close markets, ban gatherings, arrange mass burials, and burn contaminated clothing and bedding. They were, effectively, the world's first public health officials, and their model spread rapidly to cities across Europe. Although crude and often harsh, this system marked a revolutionary shift. Humanity began to perceive pestilence not as divine punishment but as a public enemy to be confronted with organization, strategy, and preventive measures. Isolation, sanitation, and systematic record-keeping became the first tools of what would later evolve into modern epidemiology. The demographic wounds inflicted by the Black Death, however, took far longer to heal. It would be nearly 2 centuries, and in some regions longer, before Europe's population recovered to pre-plague levels. This prolonged labor shortage had far-reaching economic consequences. Wages rose as surviving workers became more valuable, and the scarcity of human labor spurred technological innovation. The invention of Gutenberg's printing press in the 1450s, while not a direct result of the plague, found fertile ground in a society in which scribes were expensive and labor-saving machines suddenly highly advantageous. The plague, in effect, reshaped the economic logic of the continent, making human labor both scarce and precious, while incentivizing mechanization. The plague did not disappear but returned repeatedly, roughly once per generation, for 3 centuries. Each outbreak, a spectral presence at births, marriages, and funerals, reinforced prior lessons, deepened psychological trauma, and pressed societies to adapt. The Great Plague of London in 1665, the Italian Plague of 1629, the Vienna outbreak of 1679, and the final major Western European wave in Marseille in 1720 were all devastating reminders of the persistent threat. Only gradually, with the rise of brown rats replacing black rats and improvements in urban construction, brick and stone replacing timber and thatch, did the disease retreat, fading slowly rather than ending abruptly, leaving a world profoundly and irreversibly transformed. The Black Death thus reshaped Europe on multiple levels, biologically, socially, economically, and institutionally. It created genetic adaptations, such as CCR5 delta 32, which continue to affect human health today. It catalyzed the development of organized public health, empirical medical practice, and sophisticated urban management. It transformed labor markets, accelerated technological innovation, and redistributed wealth, laying the groundwork for the rise of merchant and banking classes who would fund the arts and humanities. And it left a lasting psychological and cultural imprint, fostering realism in art, a fascination with mortality, and the eventual emergence of humanist thought. In the aftermath of this unparalleled catastrophe, Europe did not merely recover, it slowly rebuilt a civilization capable of reason, observation, and human-centered innovation. From the ashes of death, a new world arose, one that bore both the memory of loss and the seeds of rebirth. Close your eyes and let go of all worries. Let the gentle light of sleep wrap around you like a warm, comforting blanket. Breathe slowly and evenly, letting your thoughts drift like clouds across a quiet night sky. Allow your body to relax, every muscle and every cell to rest and restore. May the night bring you peace, calm, and sweet dreams, and may the morning greet you with warmth, light, and renewed energy. Good night, sleep well.